we have explored how a nation's trade balance enters a period of disequilibrium with corrections automatically instigated in the form of changes to domestic prices, interest rates, and destabilized income and employment levels. Some of the system's auto-adjustments include economic recessions, inflation, loss of jobs, and devalued income in the domestic economy. It works, but it also causes pain. There might be other ways to accomplish the stabilization goal, which may be less distressing. This chapter begins with a look at exchange rate adjustments and the balance of payments. We will cover currency depreciation, or devaluation, affecting a nation's trade position through its impact on relative prices, incomes, and purchasing power of monetary balances. We will look into the situation where all of a firm's inputs are acquired and denominated in the domestic currency. As a result, an appreciation in the domestic currency exchange value increases that firm's costs by the same proportion in terms of foreign currencies. Next, we will consider the situation of manufacturers obtaining inputs from abroad, whose costs are denominated in terms of a foreign currency. As foreign currency denominated costs become a larger portion of a producer's total costs, an appreciation of the domestic currency exchange value leads to a smaller increase in the foreign currency cost of the firm's output and a larger decrease in the domestic cost of the firm's output as compared to the cost changes that occur when all input costs are denominated in the domestic currency. At that point, we will emphasize the elasticities approach to depreciation. According to this approach, currency depreciation leads to the greatest improvement in a country's trade position when demand elasticities are high. The time path of currency depreciation can be explained in terms of the J-curve effect and the extent to which exchange rate changes lead to changes in import prices and export prices, explained by the pass-through effect. Finally, we will explore the importance of both the absorption approach and the monetary approach to currency devaluation. According to these views, currency devaluations may initially stimulate a nation's exports and production of import-competing goods, but this will either promote excess domestic spending or expand real output if domestic absorption is reduced. These options result in a country's return to a payments deficit. Multinational companies are confronted by cost management challenges when cross-currency exchange rates rapidly fluctuate. Companies with their entire production apparatus in their domestic economy, with sales to a foreign nation, face the greatest risk of their domestic currency appreciating against their product market's currency, causing the cost of their exported goods to escalate in the foreign economy. This makes their product less affordable in that foreign market and generally results in a loss of sales. It can be especially frustrating for the domestic company, as expenses in their domestic ledger may show no real cost increases, but the exchange rate modification of their offshore sales price can spell disaster. Taking a look at this hypothetical production cost time series, we see a steel manufacturing company based in the US with clients in Switzerland. All of their production costs, including labor, raw materials, facility operations, and the management expenses, are paid for in US dollars. When their product is exported offshore, the product is charged in Swiss francs. In the initial period, the domestic costs were $500 per ton, with the exchange rate of 2 francs per US dollar, netting a Switzerland cost of 1,000 francs per ton. Moving ahead in time, cross-currency exchange rates changed to the level of an appreciating US dollar, moving from 2 francs per dollar to 4 francs per dollar. Although none of the US firms' costs increased, their conversion into Swiss francs doubled the cost of US steel in Switzerland to 2,000 francs per ton. On a price competition level, the US steel is less preferable. It may be interesting to note this happened because of an appreciation of the US dollar against the Swiss franc. But the same result would have been seen if the Swiss franc devalued against the US dollar. Either way, the international competitiveness of the U.S. steel manufacturer is reduced by the modified U.S. dollar-Swiss franc exchange rate. Now, a slightly different spin on this situation. Consider the U.S. steel manufacturer with headquarters in the U.S., but they acquire scrap metal from Switzerland with costs denominated in francs. Now we step back to the appreciation of the US dollar against the Swiss franc to see that the scrap metal cost acquired in Switzerland dropped in US dollar terms from $180 to $90 per ton. All other costs being equal, the appreciation of the US dollar against the Swiss franc caused US production costs to reduce from $500 to $410 per ton. In US dollar terms, when the reduced cost final steel product is exported to Switzerland and valued in their foreign currency, the exchange rate differential takes the price from the original 1,000 francs per ton to 1,640 francs, instead of 2,000 francs per ton. The exchange rate migration still results in a cost increase to the Swiss buyer, but foreign sourcing, also through Switzerland, moderated the increased cost effects. The generalizations shown here and written about in the textbook give clear indication of how mixing the sources of raw materials between the domestic country and the end user's country acted as a hedge against currency valuation changes as they affect costs and revenues. In this case, it happened when the US dollar appreciated against the Swiss franc, but it could just as easily have happened as a Swiss franc devaluation. In both situations, a company spreading its costs and revenue factors to various currency-linked countries can assist the manufacturer when moderating potential losses. A difficult consideration the manufacturer must consider is which countries to target for its cross-currency buffering. It is not always so convenient that the foreign nation is both a raw material supplier and also a primary final product consumer. That situation makes the cross-national currency decision clear. It becomes complicated when 3, 4, or 10 other nations are both categorized as raw material suppliers and final product consumers. But maybe your company needs raw materials from only 1 or 2 of the 10. Taken into the global level, for a U.S. company, the effect of migrating exchange rates must be taken as the relative value of the US dollar against the sea of other currencies involved with trade between their countries and the US. When the US dollar appreciates against other currencies, in general, the change will lead to a decrease in the cost of foreign countries' raw materials, while also creating a price increase in the final export product sales to the linked countries. A final product export cost increase causes the quantity of foreign sold items to decrease. However, the changed value of the US dollar may result in an increase of imported goods to the US, which comparatively results in a lower foreign origin price. US dollar depreciation will initiate the opposite situations, including an increase of US exports. I stress to you the importance of understanding these two ideas concerning currency appreciation and depreciation. Be able to reason out in your mind these expected outcomes for the domestic currency and the currencies of your trading partners. You will use this information a lot in this chapter and in economics generally. Staying ahead of fluctuating cross-currency values can be a never-ending endeavor. Predicting future currency appreciation or devaluation is difficult enough, but knowing if the changes are temporary or permanent falls into the realm of crystal ball forecasting.
Only then can you see. Try again. Now, what do we have here?
Oh, do you mind me trying?
Exchange rate appreciation, possibly.
My dear, from the first moment you stepped foot in my class, I sensed that you did not possess the proper spirit for the noble art of divination. No, you see, there. You may be young in years, but the heart that beats beneath your bosom is as shriveled as an old maid's, your soul as dry as the pages of the books to which you so desperately cleave.
Nonetheless, companies seek strategies mitigating the situation of being unprepared for cross-currency valuation changes. Some companies have initiated production factories in other countries that have exhibited counter-reactive economies from their home economy. It might be Japanese automakers also investing in production sites in the US, Mexico, Philippines, Brazil, Portugal, and 50 other locations around the world. When profitable, they can modify material acquisition and assembly accounting for currency valuation. Of course, they also have to keep on top of tariffs and quotas in the profit optimization profile. Another strategy for the multinational company is to tighten profit margins as currency values change. The exporter reduces profit margins into the importing country to counteract an increase in their currency value against the import receiving country's cost of goods. If the product has price-driven competitiveness in the foreign market, this can serve the exporter by maintaining market share. That tries to bridge the short-term adjustments to currency values. The company may view lower profits as an acceptable alternative to reduced sale quantities and overall profitability as long as they can maintain their market share. Again, foreign companies need to beware of dumping allegations, so be cautious and be prepared to celebrate partial success. Foreign competitiveness forces businesses to seek solutions that can survive increasing raw material costs, lowering final product prices, and difficult to predict cross-currency valuation cycles. Some businesses have enjoyed success in this realm, while others have faded away. Most success stories share the feature of low-cost manufacturing, highly efficient product design, and low commencement to market latency. When they start building a product, it does not take long for it to arrive on the retail store in the destination country. As an example, we can look into the appreciation of the Japanese yen in the 1990s, as its value rose 40% in relation to the US dollar. As the yen increased in value, the cost of Japanese products in the US climbed by an equal amount. Instead of taking a loss in sales because of their higher prices, Japanese firms redirected manufacturing efforts to the US and the dollar-linked Asian countries, where their comparative costs were lower. This positioning allowed Japanese firms to use less expensive dollar-denominated parts and materials to offset higher yen-related costs. They also used the stronger yen to purchase certain components from other countries, representing a lower net cost after inflated yen value was factored in. Because of the offshoring established by Japanese firms in the 1980s and early 90s, the acceleration of changed production possibilities gave them a competitive edge. Hitachi was a widely known name of TVs in the 1990s. As it turns out, their components combined video projection units made in the USA with circuitry and chassis made in Malaysia, and final assembly in Japan, where only about 30% of the TV set's final value was integrated. The appreciation of the yen against the other currencies during this period meant Hitachi could shelter 70% of its costs from the appreciating currency. However, in an aggressive step of more cost-cutting, Hitachi migrated their final assembly work to Mexico, where the peso devalued against both the dollar and the yen, resulting in competitive cost final products in the global markets, despite the rise of the value of the yen. Japanese automobile manufacturers in this period made their first priced competitive moves to reduce profit margins and convinced their subcontractors to reduce their prices by 15%. Their automotive design and assembly strategy involved restyling across models to use interchangeable component parts and repatterned domestically produced sheet metal. Toyota also changed their marketing focus to target lower-priced models, with fewer options on cars shipped to countries like the US. You may also remember from a previous lecture that in the 1980s, Japanese companies agreed to a voluntary export quota to the US, limiting their shipments of Japanese-made vehicles, giving them incentive to manufacture automobiles in transplant factories in the USA. Given the appreciation of the yen over the US dollar, this reallocation of manufacturing fit nicely into the Japanese cost-cutting scheme. They took advantage of these plans in the face of appreciating yen to grow their business. Fast forwarding to the end of the last century, the US dollar strengthened against major currencies of Asia and Europe by about 22%. The dollar appreciation against the currencies of our trading partners caused significant foreign price increases for US products overseas. Two example companies given in the textbook show opposing response profiles to the same situation. In the first example, the U.S. firm Sipco Moldings took a reverting position by laying off 30% of their U.S. employees and partnering with an Austrian company who built the products Sipco had designed, while the Austrian company shipped the completed tools to Sipco in the U.S. for final sales. Costs were cut, but the core business of the company evaporated. Their production services were sent to Austria, where they still remain. In the other example, American Feed Company collaborated with a Spanish firm in a duopolistic arrangement. American Feed and their Spanish counterpart collaborated to streamline joint production, but divided contracts between their operations to eliminate cross-partner competition, with each taking the contracts matching their physical locations. By eliminating competition between the two companies and partnering on cost proposals, they were able to float through the period of the US dollar appreciation cycle. We have looked at currency appreciation cases that have led to a reduction of foreign sales for domestic exporting companies. Domestic goods become more expensive in the foreign markets, making a shift of their supply curve to the left, resulting in a higher equilibrium price and lower quantity sold. When taken in the reverse, the domestic currency devalues, foreign sales quantity increases. But can a currency devaluation reduce a country's trade deficit? It seems reasonable, but we should look for any externalities associated with specific cases. Trade deficits are observed when a country imports more than it exports. When a currency devalues compared to other currencies, a cost approach gives expectation for lowered imports and increased exports. The details of the trade balance interactions require a look under the hood, so to say, at the price elasticity of demand for both a nation's imports and its exports. Elasticity of demand expresses buyers' responsiveness to changes in the product's price. We can recall the formula for elasticity of demand and remember the terms for elastic demand, inelastic demand, and unitary demand. Each condition holds different implications for the manufactured product's quantity sold for the prices offered. Elasticity of demand will hold different values in each market where products are sold, meaning that the response to price modifications can be unequal in each market. Let us take a close look at a currency exchange rate situation from recent memories, starting in the mid-1980s. In blue, we see the Japanese yen scaled on the left side axis, and in red, the Chinese yuan renminbi, scaled to the right axis. The yen is a free-floating currency on world markets exchanged under the auspices of demand and supply. The horizontal lines are the exchange rate for the Chinese yuan renminbi. China does not have a floating exchange rate that is determined by market forces, as is the case with most advanced economies such as the yen. Instead, it pegs its currency, the yuan renminbi, to the US dollar. The yuan was pegged to the US currency at 8.27 to the dollar in February 1994. then to about 8.3 until June 2005. Undoubtedly, the rise of the US dollar during the 1980s, and more so, the massive devaluation of the won renminbi in January 1994 from 5.8210 to 8.7219, created a favorable exchange rate environment for exporting goods from China. As a country, China made their goods less expensive for foreign nation companies to purchase. China's central bank shocked markets on 11th of August 2015 when it devalued its currency from 6.2096 to 6.3908 to the US dollar, a 1.87% shift weaker against the US dollar. A day later, the central bank sent shockwaves again with a second devaluation, pushing down the price to 6.4083, another 1.62% shift against the US dollar. Shock waves rippled through China to encompass global trading partners with a regional currency war as China's moves came on the back of the softening of the Japanese yen and the Korean won through 2015. By the end of 2016, the won renminbi was trading for 6.95 per dollar. China's currency devaluation was seen largely as a bid to boost the competitiveness of its exports, but it is not without implications for its ambition to internalize their currency as a component of the global special drawing rights. Perhaps the biggest dent in the trend was the global financial crisis of 2008-09, which put a big lid on U.S. consumer demand. China's rapid growth since the 1980s has been fueled by massive exports. A significant chunk of these exports goes to the U.S., which overtook the European Union as China's largest export market in 2012. The tremendous expansion in economic ties between the U.S. and China, which accelerated with China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, and is evident with China as our largest goods trading partner with $578.6 billion in total. Goods exported totaled $115.8 billion. Goods imports total $462.8 billion. The Federal Reserve Economic Data Portal makes economic data digitally and graphically available through its online interface. Two of the most significant data sets are the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, and the Producer Price Index, the PPI. The PPI is a significant data set for businesses as it measures a commercial market basket of commodities bought and sold by American businesses. The index values represent a prism-shaped lens for American producers, as it measures both prices and quantities of transactions commonly used by American businesses. The path of the PPI through time shows the anticipated expansionary periods following most recessions and the dropping or slowing of the index values during recessions. The contraction pattern in 2009 was severe, with an aggressive recovery response lasting only until about mid-2011, when other forces restricted business expansions normally seen in the U.S. economy. The stumbling steps reflected in the PPI index came from a series of new government regulations, increased tax rates, and imposition of the Affordable Care Act on U.S. companies and consumers to the point that significant American businesses moved operations to other countries where the cost of doing business was lower. As 2014 progressed, prices paid to U.S. manufacturers and the volume they sold continued dropping. The trend line shown here replicates another recessionary period from June 2014 through February 2016. This drop in PPI index values was accentuated by the devaluation of the won renminbi in August 2015, as the PPI value was 191.9 in August 2015, fell to 189.1 in September, and finally to 181.3 in February 2016. American businesses were not able to compete against the lower-priced Chinese-sourced goods. At the time, many American buyers shifted source orders to lower-cost Chinese goods, and some companies such as General Motors Corporation, established manufacturing facilities in China. Both prices and quantities sourced from the USA were reduced. The Marshall-Lerner Condition is at the heart of the elasticity approach to the balance of payments. It is named after the economists who revealed it independently, British economist Alfred Marshall and the economist Abraham Lerner, a Russian national who immigrated first to Britain then to the USA. The condition seeks to answer the question, when does a real devaluation in the fixed exchange rates or a real depreciation in floating exchange rates of the currency improve the current account balance of a country? The Marshall-Lerner Condition postulates that an exchange rate devaluation or depreciation will only cause a balance of trade improvement if the absolute sum of the long-run export and import demand elasticity is equal to or greater than 1. Thinking it through, if the domestic currency devalues, there will be a positive quantity effect on the balance of trade because domestic consumers will buy fewer imports and foreign consumers will buy more of our exports. Working contrary to this, however, is a negative cost effect on the balance of trade, since the relative cost of imports will be higher. The net effect on the trade balance can be positive or negative, depending on the magnitude of the quantity effect versus the cost effect. If the quantity effect is greater, then the Marshall-Lerner Condition is met. We look at example of UK pound depreciation relative to the currencies of its trading partners. In the UK, the demand elasticity for imports is 2.5, while for exports it is 1.5. Variable elasticities of demand are common. When the UK pound depreciates by 10% against the US dollar, import prices increase due to the devaluation of the domestic currency. It takes 10% more UK pounds to purchase the goods in US dollars, leading to a decrease in domestic purchases of UK goods. The import demand elasticity of 2.5 results in a 25% quantity decrease and a matching 10% price increase in pounds. The net effects of these events lead to a net outpayment decrease for the import sector and a 15% increase for the export sector. On the export side of the equation, the UK pound price decrease makes the cost of UK goods exported to the US less expensive, resulting in an increased quantity of offshore sales. With an export demand elasticity of 1.5 and 10% currency devaluation, net foreign sales are stimulated by 15%. This intermix of increased exports and reduced imports reduces the UK trade deficit. In this case, the sum of elasticities of demand is 4.0, meeting the Marshall-Lerner Condition of the sum of elasticities greater than 1. The Marshall-Lerner Condition states that if the domestic currency devalues, there will be a positive quantity effect on the balance of trade, because domestic consumers will buy fewer imports and foreign consumers will buy more exports, but only if their elasticities of demand offset by a sufficient amount. As an economist for a company, as a consultant, or as a government policy analyst, how would you use the Marshall-Lerner Condition to your benefit? The first response cycle to consider is when your domestic economy is in a trade deficit and enters a currency devaluation cycle. You need to consider the expected semi-automatic responses in the economy and how they will influence the trade deficit situation. Taken to the next level, when you identify the expected response pattern and it is favorable, you want to make sure that response pattern is not prevented through poor business decisions or nonsensical political maneuvers. Be ready. Consider what happened in August 2015 as China devalued the exchange rate for the yuan renminbi. A weak currency cheapens the price of a country's exports, making them more attractive to international buyers by undercutting competitors. From China's perspective, their goal is to contract, manufacture, and export consumer and commercial goods to trading partners, such as Europe, North America, and through the Asian market areas. China is less dependent on foreign imports of consumer goods to China than other countries are dependent on China exports to their markets, such as the USA. By devaluing their currency, China made Chinese-sourced goods more affordable by companies in other nations. China is focused on their export price elasticity. But since the yuan renminbi is not valued as a free-floating exchange rate, determination of price elasticities is problematic and relies on heuristic estimates of key variables. Researchers Fenestra and Wee, in China's growing role in world trade, estimated elasticities of the real exchange rate on China's overall trade flows to be relatively small in comparison to other nations. China is able to maintain a substantial export trade component when the yuan renminbi is devalued. Export quantities sold increase by a greater amount than the currency exchange rate is decreased. This is, by definition, a low export price elasticity. Total revenue increases with the exchange rate reaction to the currency devaluation. Of more significance to China's trade balance is the vitality of markets in other countries, in particular the United States, China's largest trading partner. Slow growth in China's trading partner countries delivers significantly more impact on the trade deficit of China than does the export price elasticity rate. Studies show that international trade tends to be inelastic in the short term, as it takes time to change patterns of consumption and pre-existing trade contracts to expire. Thus, the Marshall-Lerner condition of elasticities summing to greater than 1 is not met, and currency devaluation is likely to worsen the trade balance initially. There is predictably a lag time between the initial response and the ultimate adjustment. In the long run, consumers tend to adjust to new prices, and the nation's trade balance improves. This time path of trade flows is called the J-curve effect. For example, assume a country, like the US, is a net importer of oil and a net producer of jetliners. Initially, a currency's devaluation immediately increases the price of oil, and the consumption patterns remain the same in the short term. An increased amount of money is domestically spent on imported oil, worsening the deficit on the import side. Meanwhile, it takes some time for Boeing's sales department to exploit the lower price advantage offshore and secure new contracts. On this diagram, the U.S. has a current account deficit at point X. The U.S. dollar exchange rate devalues because of existing procurement contracts and imperfect knowledge. In the short term, the deficit gets deeper to Y. In the long term, if the Marshall-Lerner condition is fulfilled, export revenue will increase, and import expenditures will fall. The current account deficit will get smaller, moving in the direction of Z. The Marshall-Lerner condition, extended into the J-curve effect, puts definition to import and export changes of a nation's international trade value. However, the effects in markets will be seen only after delays have worked through the system. The lags reflect businesses' commerce realities. Sometimes time offsets involve offers that have been made and accepted before the currency revaluation happened. The agreements are signed and therefore binding. Companies can use currency forward contracts or currency futures to keep commerce operating through the economic cycles like currency devaluations, but the preparedness efforts do not prevent lag time effects. In other real terms, individual businesses are not necessarily opening and closing new agreements on a daily basis. There is a lag time between the expiration of an existing agreement and the opening of a new one under new terms. These events transpire within the new economic realities, contributing to the delayed effects in the currency devaluation impacts. These lag times were seen in the U.S. from 1980 through 1993 as the domestic economy went through an appreciation cycle in 1980, followed by a devaluation in 1985. The appreciation event's delayed effects overlapped the devaluation event's initial response.
President Trump's objective on this trip to Beijing was in part to persuade China to do more to rein in the nuclear program and the missile program of its client state, North Korea. But how well did the self-proclaimed master of the art of the deal do on his other main objective here, namely persuading China to do more to close its trade gap with America? Here's Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen.
Among the $250 billion in new trade agreements announced during President Trump's visit to Beijing are a deal for the China Energy Investment Corporation to pour $84 billion into West Virginia power projects and a 20% reduction in the value-added tax China places on imports of American distillers' dried grains. Among those unimpressed, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson.
Quite frankly, in the grand scheme of a $300 to $500 billion trade deficit, the things that have been achieved thus far are pretty small.
Candidate Trump vowed often to redress that deficit.
When I'm there, we turn it around, folks. We have the cards. We have a lot of power with China.
In Beijing, President Trump proved only marginally more conciliatory, saying he doesn't blame China, but rather his predecessors in the Oval Office who allowed the deficit to grow.
After all, who can blame a country for being able to take advantage of another country for the benefit of its citizens? I give China great credit.
Last year, the world's two largest economies traded an estimated $579 billion in goods. But last month, the imbalance grew by 12.2% over the year before. Rituals of American presidents' visits to China include an exchange of toasts between visitors and hosts and promises by the latter to expand market access for U.S. businesses and investors.
The investment and management environment for foreign enterprises, including those of the U.S., will be more open, more transparent, and more standardized.
But veteran China hands expressed skepticism that Beijing would do much to address the multiple factors that contribute to the imbalance.
I question whether the bilateral trade deficit is the biggest problem in the relationship. I'm far more worried about these other practices like compulsory technology transfer, lack of protection for intellectual property rights, subsidies to state-owned enterprises.
Candidate Trump also called China the greatest ever currency manipulator and promised repeatedly to designate Beijing as such. But within his first 90 days in office, President Trump rescinded that threat, telling the Wall Street Journal China had stopped the practice. Brett?
James Rosen in Washington. James, thanks.
Exchange rate pass-through is conditional on the business relationships between buyers and sellers. It happens when a seller, for instance from the USA, experiences a currency appreciation cycle against the currency of a long-term client, say from India. Assume the US manufacturer and the Indian buyer denominated contract costs in US dollars. Now assume the US dollar appreciates against the Indian rupee by 20%. In a full pass-through arrangement, the US goods would be supplied to India at a cost increase of 20% when paid in rupee. In reality, the actual pass-through arrangements rely on business relationships and long-term operations of both parties, and frequently result in partial pass-through of currency appreciation or devaluation events. The U.S. company may be concerned that an immediate increase of their product costs to the buyer would make an opening for a competitor using a different currency to capture market share against the U.S. company. To head off this unfortunate event, the U.S. manufacturer may negotiate payment adjustments with the buyer to share the burden of exchange rate changes. Exchange rate pass-through in the U.S. and a few associated countries from 1973 through 2003 shows that on average, there was about a 0.5% pass-through from manufacturer to buyer as a result of each 1% of currency devaluations. This table shows that for every 1% the US dollar value changed, the price of imports to the US changed by 0.42%. Currency selection for international transactions is part of business negotiations. The US dollar is the default currency for most of the world, although regional selections are found in Europe, for instance, using the euro, and in Australia, using their dollar. When the transaction currency is named as part of negotiations, the appreciation or devaluation of the currency remains linked to the currency of choice. Because of the prevalence of the default use of the US dollar, currency swings tend to affect prices of foreign businesses more than the US businesses. Risk is borne by the businesses located in non-US currency countries when using the US dollar for import and export pricing. Market share positioning, as mentioned earlier, can be a significant issue involved in partial pass-through pricing. When considering US imports, a foreign supplier involved in imperfectly competitive markets may cut into their profit margin to absorb a portion of an increased currency exchange cost in order to preserve their market share in the lucrative US marketplace. Transportation costs of products imported into the US are all encumbered domestically and are not foreign commodity affected by currency valuations. However, when considering imports to the US, the costs of moving them from the arrival port to the final retail sale destination can account for substantial fees when expressed as a percent of total cost. In the US, these distribution costs amount to about 40% of the retail sales price of all goods. As importing companies manage pressures of cost reduction efforts associated with currency revaluations, they have tried to keep distribution costs in line with retail sales prices, often trimming when possible. We talked about the elasticity approach, the Marshall-Lerner condition, and the J-curve effect. The absorption and monetary approaches dovetail into this chain of reasoning by considering domestic spending during an economic depreciation or appreciation. To begin, we will look at the absorption approach as a measure of how resources are consumed in the home nation in terms of consumption, investments, and government expenditures. According to the elasticities approach, currency devaluation offers a price incentive to reduce imports and increase exports. However, a country's trade balance is heavily affected by the performance of domestic consumers to purchase foreign versus domestically produced goods. The absorption approach considers the impact of currency depreciation on the spending behavior within the domestic economy and its influence on the nation's trade balance. We start with a relationship we identified earlier for total spending, also called domestic output, as being the sum of consumption, investments, government spending, and net exports. Net exports being the difference between the total exports and the total imports. The absorption approach rearranges these variables to sum consumption, investment, and government expenditures into a variable called absorption, and to isolate net exports into a balance of trade variable. Rearranged, Y equals A plus B, or domestic output equals absorption plus net exports. Therefore, net exports equals domestic output minus absorption. This relates back to the nation's trade balance. If the national output exceeds domestic absorption, the trade balance will be positive. A negative trade balance suggests that the economy is spending beyond its ability to produce. The absorption approach predicts that a currency depreciation will improve an economy's trade balance only if national output rises relative to absorption. It works in the country's favor during a currency depreciation case only if the country can sell more goods to other nations than it consumes domestically. This means that a country must increase total output and reduce absorption. Now consider the U.S. in the second half of 2015. The country has 25 million unemployed people and a $14 trillion trade deficit. Our economy was operating below its productive capacity. Price incentives initiated by US dollar depreciation would normally engage idle resources into the production of goods for export, while diverting spending away from imports to domestically produced goods. Currency devaluation in this case could spur domestic output as well as improve the trade balance. The absorption approach goes beyond the elasticity approach by combining the economy's trade balance with the other aspects of the national economy. It engages the economy's utilization of national endowments and productivity with prudent frugality, emphasizing the reality of the nation living within its means. The balance of payments deficits are faced by countries, large and small, and strategies are sought to minimize the negative effects on the domestic economy. Both the elasticity approach and the absorption approach we have just discussed are considered viable options, and they are often used for the intended benefits. The monetary approach has also been engaged to correct balance of payment deficits, but from a different angle. The monetary approach takes the position that governments, by purposefully devaluing the domestic currency against other currencies, especially against the currencies of trading partners, will quickly cause an increase in the domestic economy's export potential as domestic export prices become more competitive internationally. Some countries, mostly in Latin America and Asia, have actively followed a policy of exchange rate devaluation in an effort to maintain or promote a balance of payments equilibrium. The pursuit of these policies contributes to the International Monetary Fund's view that devaluation is a valid policy in resolving balance of payments problems. Several analyses of this approach have been made, with conclusions published in 1988 by Parviz Asheghian of St. Lawrence University and William Foote of Syracuse University, both in New York. First, in the short run, devaluation of the currency successfully improves the balance of payments only for developing countries, without similar positive effects in developed countries. On the other hand, increasing the economic growth around the date of the currency devaluation deteriorates the balance of payments for developed countries in the short run, but has no effect on developing countries' balance of payment. This result implies that the income elasticity of money demand is negative in developed countries during currency devaluations, and zero for developing countries, a result counter to the usual predictions of money demand theory. It may be that in the case of developed countries, increases in income during currency devaluation leads to lower demand for money since the domestic currency is worth less by government fiat. Holding money may cause disutility to domestic consumers, resulting in a switch from holding officially reported money stocks to holding other assets or resorting to counter-trade activity. Second, in the short run, domestic credit expansion deteriorates the balance of payments of both developing countries and developed countries. In the long run, this variable worsens the balance of payments deficit of developing countries and has no significant effect on the balance of payments of developed countries. Third, economic growth does not affect balance of payments during devaluation episodes either in the short or long run for developing countries. Conversely, developed countries in the short run do experience favorable effects in this situation, but they expire as stretched into the long run. This provides further evidence that the growth rate of income is unrelated to mandated currency devaluation. Finally, the data cannot corroborate existence of any structural differences between the relative responsiveness of the developed and developing countries to devaluation in the short run. The only structural difference detected was for the balance of payments improvement in the long run. Parviz Asheghian and William Foote gave this topic a good review to illustrate the monetary approach's marginal usefulness for developed nations and only partial success for developing nations' economies. A take-home message from this summary is to be skeptical of what you hear and read, to the level that you will look for points of view and begin to understand for yourself how to generate reasonable results. The findings shared in this lecture are consistent with my view of economics and expected results. They illustrate critical thinking as applied to economies and business operations. Look for and develop solutions that explain to you personally how events respond to economic conditions. You can find answers or use logic to explain them to yourself and others. As I have urged before, and I support for your adoption of critical thinking, think like an economist. In this chapter, we considered exchange rate adjustments and the balance of payments. We noted that currency depreciation or devaluation can affect a nation's trade position through its impact on relative prices, incomes, and purchasing power of monetary balances. We considered the situation where all of the firm's outputs are acquired domestically and their costs are denominated in the domestic currency. As a result, an appreciation in the domestic currency's exchange value increases a firm's costs by the same proportion in terms of the foreign currency. Next, we considered the situation where manufacturers obtain inputs from abroad whose costs are denominated in terms of a foreign currency. As foreign currency denominated costs become a larger portion of a producer's total costs, an appreciation of the domestic currency's exchange value leads to a smaller increase in the foreign currency cost of the firm's output and a larger decrease in the domestic cost of the firm's output, as compared to the cost changes that occur when all input costs are denominated in the domestic currency. We emphasized the elasticities approach to depreciation, when currency depreciation leads to the greatest improvement in a country's trade position if demand elasticities are high. The time path of currency depreciation can be explained in terms of the J-curve effect, and the extent to which exchange rate changes lead to changes in import prices and export prices is explained by the pass-through effect. Finally, we concluded with a summary of the absorption approach and monetary approach to currency devaluation events. Theoretically sound, but practically limited. A devaluation may initially stimulate a nation's exports and production of import-competing goods, but this often promotes excess domestic spending unless real output can be expanded or domestic absorption reduced. The result becomes a return to a payments deficit.